A thought on the end of history as defined by us and as defined by them. Let's call it the West and the East, for horrible, simplified reasons. We all know the cliche of the end of history, Fukuyama, and the great complacency which I believe it represented, which is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of history had come, the final triumph of liberal capitalism, everything else was a matter of detail. And the only cause for complexity was what evolved in the 90s, which was, oops, now that we've finished an ideological war, there's going to be a whole bunch of regional ethnic wars, aka the Balkans. Therefore, as long as we keep those under control, however, and manage them, the general trend of history, that the arc of history is bending in a liberal capitalist direction. And in our optimism, I think in the 80s, though I was never quite there in the optimistic stakes, maybe I'd spent too long in the embassy in Beijing in the 80s to feel completely optimistic about it.
It was as optimistic as anyone was going to get that period.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I was also in Beijing in 89, in May and early June. I wasn't there on June 4. And so that then ran into this enormous brick wall where the decisions then, 29 years ago, were decisive about which way the regime wished to go. And so, following that, as you then said, you had two major developments. Come 92, Deng Xiaoping, who had given the ultimate green light to the crackdown of 89, then travelled south to Shenzhen and his famous Nanxun and his southern expedition, and said, we need to go faster and harder on reform. Well, that confused everybody. Because we had this massive crackdown in Beijing, that was the end of that. And what was he meaning, go faster and harder on reform? Well, in fact, what he meant was we'll have more perestroika, but maybe a little less glasnost. We'll have a fair bit more opening to the Western world. We might not have as much, as it were, reform on the political side. And then that flowed through, I think, through the Jiang Zemin period. And I think by the time you get to the late 90s, and I'm interested in your views on this, there's this massive internal debate in the party, secret debate, about is the game up? That is, are we going to face the end of history exactly as Fukuyama's predicted? We managed to survive as a regime through the events of 89. Mm-hmm. Do we now need to think about the long-term transformation of the Chinese Communist Party into a form of social democratic party, maybe with Singaporean characteristics, rather than submit ourselves to a violent revolution at some stage? And then the period 98 to 2001, there's a big internal debate about this. But they resolve that no, they can actually create their own history, and that it won't be the end of history as defined by the West. And so what's the end of history defined by Xi Jinping? I think Xi Jinping's conclusion, coming out of the events of that internal party debate, which preceded him, really, because it was resolved at the end of the Jiang Zemin period in about 2001. Xi Jinping's view is that we, the authoritarian party, can hang on. And our end of history is, in fact, a form of authoritarian or state capitalism. And a different end of history for us is grafting on a new level of civilizational greatness around, let's call it, the global standing of Greater China. If I was trying to summarize, the Xi Jinping dream. To end that little reflection, of course, the internal debate within China still is Xi Jinping's view of the end of history so described, which is the party still in control, a state capitalist system, reasonable levels of wealth, some level of personal freedom, no political freedom, and with a continued control of the economy, still through significant state-owned enterprises. Is there a counter voice to that? And I think there is. So on your question is, what is the end of history? I don't think it's ours. I don't necessarily think it's theirs at this stage as either. There's still, however, a deep impulse towards what we would broadly describe as freedom.